Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Dr. Eleanor, and joining me on the panel is Dr. Elisa, Dr. Skye, and Dr. Sonja. The purpose of our discussion today involves the case study of a female psychologist named Emma, who has recently accepted a new referral for a male client named Jacques, who is suffering anxiety and depression. Upon meeting Jacques, Emma learns that he hasn't lived in Australia for long and migrated here from France only 3 years earlier. Whilst his English is quite proficient, his mannerisms and presentation is still quite foreign. As a result, Jacques greets Emma by leaning in to give her the traditional French greeting by kissing her on either cheek. While Emma feels this is unprofessional, she learns that the primary reason Jacques left France was because his wife confessed that she loved another man and left him unexpectedly. His hurt and sense of rejection was compounded by the fact that he has had trouble making friends since being in Australia. While recently approaching the reception desk, Jacques once again leans in to kiss Emma goodbye. However, this time, Emma's colleague and their client witness the exchange. Emma is left feeling distressed and anxious as she feels that the exchanges are inappropriate. However, she is also now aware of how sensitive Jacques may be to any form of social rejection, thus leaving her in a very difficult situation. Ethical dilemmas require a decision-making process that is informed by the relevant code of ethics, advice from colleagues, ethical principles, and a guiding decision-making model. As a result, we have decided to explore this case study through adopting the 8-step model by Kuchar and Keith Spiegel to help Emma determine the best outcome. Following this model, step 1 is to determine whether this matter truly involves ethics. To do this, we need to investigate the situation in more detail by examining the key principles of the APS Code of Ethics. The Psychology Board of Australia and the Code articulates ethical principles to psychologists and the public by providing standards of ethical professional conduct. By examining these, we can determine whether this matter involves ethics. General Principle A, which is respect for the rights and dignity of people and peoples, considers principles of respect, dignity, and individual rights such as autonomy and justice. General Principle B, propriety, incorporates principles of responsibility and competency. Lastly, General Principle C, integrity, acknowledges that psychologists are placed in a reputable position of power and trust, and thus must act with honesty in their conduct. By considering these principles and guidelines, it is clear that this is an ethical issue, as Emma has been faced with the decision between having to uphold the dignity of her client, having to represent the public and the psychology profession, and having to incorporate this in a manner that is appropriate and honest. Adhering to this can be difficult to navigate, as there are attributes from all 3 general principles Emma must abide to. However, as Jacques is in a vulnerable state with heavy feelings of rejection and isolation, it is difficult to predict the consequences of available alternatives as we attempt to make a decision about how to best confront this ethical problem. It's therefore clear this situation is not black and white. There are indeed varying shades of grey, and while it has now been determined this is an ethical matter, the next step is to consult guidelines that might apply as a possible mechanism for resolution. Upholding ethical principles is an integral feature of successful practice. For a profession to earn a trustworthy reputation, the public must have trust in those who practice. That trust is ultimately determined by the commitment to uphold professional and ethical standards. In regards to consulting guidelines that may be of resolution, it is important for Emma to note the 2 aspects that the Code of Ethics involves. Enforceable aspects, which are specific rules such as maintaining confidentiality, or aspirational aspects, which are general principles that guide behaviour. She will need to consult both aspects in order to determine her best outcome. The ethical guidelines of respect state that psychologists obtain and document informed consent from clients prior to using psychological procedures that entail physical contact with clients. This is relevant specifically due to its mention of physical contact. Perhaps Emma could consult this guideline and explain to Jacques that physical touch refers to a gesture such as a handshake, not a kiss on both cheeks. This demonstrates that she is abiding to these guidelines and is doing so professionally, not rejectingly. In terms of enacting pragmatic guidelines, these are noted in propriety, specifically in relation to professional competence. Ethical Standard B.1.4 states psychologists continuously monitor their professional functioning. If they become aware of problems that may impair their ability to provide competent psychological services, they take appropriate measures to address the problem by, in this situation, obtaining professional advice about whether they should limit, suspend, or terminate the provision of psychological services. Based on how her relationship with Jacques continues, Emma can follow this guideline if required. In conjunction, Ethical Standard B.3 notes that psychologists provide psychological services in a responsible manner and provides a set of guidelines, such as acting with care and skill, taking responsibility for reasonably foreseeable consequences, and taking reasonable steps to prevent harm occurring as a result of their conduct. This is mostly in relation to Jacques' future behaviour after the situation is addressed, which Emma can consult, as his psychological state may require monitoring. On a personal level, integrity is critical to consider, as Emma is in a position of trust and power that she must honour to herself, her profession, and to Jacques. Therefore, she should consult the ethical standard C.2.2, which states psychologists take reasonable steps to correct any misrepresentation made by them or about them within a reasonable time after becoming aware of this misrepresentation. This would be appropriate as Emma maintains her professionalism whilst also providing honesty in her relationship with Jacques. While the solution does not necessarily become clear at this point, collecting this relevant information constitutes a critical step to take conscientiously. I will now pass over to Dr. Elisa to elaborate the third and fourth steps of the model accordingly.
Now that Emma has sought to establish the characteristics of the dilemma via steps 1 and 2, she can now exemplify the ethical principle of integrity by turning inward and reflecting upon how her values, prejudices, and personal needs may influence her objectivity and ability to resolve the situation ethically. Although she is aware that ethical guidelines advocate the use of proper professional boundaries with clients, she is also aware of the many extraneous factors which may otherwise have the potential to cause harm to her client, her career, and her profession. As a trained professional, Emma relies on her values during challenging times to enable her to make prudent judgments. Her values underpin her efficacy as a psychologist and enhance her sense of personal identity. As such, Emma's first consideration is to determine whether there is conflict between her professional and personal values. Personally, Emma feels at ease being affectionate and warm with her family and friends. Emma has always felt that affection amongst loved ones is part of a healthy relationship and never hesitates to hug her nearest and dearest whenever the opportunity arises. Professionally, Emma feels that aside from a platonic pat on the back or a handshake amongst colleagues, that affection of any kind is awkward, unnecessary, and rife with potential problems. As Emma realises that the situation conflicts with her professional values, she needs to consider whether those values must be given priority under these specific circumstances. Whilst there is merit in upholding professional values, Emma is also aware that following rules without consideration for the unique circumstances can create barriers between psychologist and client and undermine trust in the therapeutic relationship. Specifically, consideration of culturally sensitive variables must be factored, as Emma acknowledges Jacques' perspective and perhaps his ignorance regarding formalities in the Australian culture. As such, Emma must weigh up her professional values against the possibility of offending or humiliating Jacques if she raised her concerns. Furthermore, Emma is acutely aware of Jacques' sensitivity to social rejection and must weigh up the benefit of removing the physical exchange against her professional obligation to avoid harming her client. Emma has had to recognise her personal needs and determine whether her anxiety surrounding the situation is also fueled by her own agenda. As such, Emma acknowledges that as a very ambitious woman, she is concerned that the situation could cast a shadow of doubt over her credibility amongst her colleagues and lead to possible discrimination in her workplace regarding the type of clients she is offered. Finally, Emma is concerned about whether the physical exchange could be misconstrued by Jacques and could create sexual overtones for him in future. In order to consider the different perspectives of the situation, Emma now moves on to step 4 to consult with experienced colleagues. Although Emma would much rather discuss the situation with her friend and colleague Olga, she is aware that Olga is less experienced in the field and may be swayed towards agreeing with Emma for the sake of the friendship and workplace congruence. For this reason, Emma decides to approach the colleague who witnessed the exchange due to his strong commitment to the profession and keen appreciation for ethical standards. Carl was also a good option as he was more senior than Emma and would be able to provide a male perspective. Her first question was to ask Carl whether he felt the exchange was inappropriate and why. Carl admitted that he was surprised at the time and grew curious as to whether Emma knew this client in her personal life due to the intimate nature of the farewell. Carl was relieved to hear that Emma had been equally taken aback and was now unsure how to proceed based on Jacques' sensitivity to rejection. Although by now Emma was quite confident in her evaluation of the appropriateness of Jacques' actions, she felt it necessary to also consult with her old supervisor, who she still considers her professional confidant. Another reason for seeking out her supervisor is that Jan had always been forthright in her approach to mentoring and was not typically an agreeable woman if she felt that her opinion of the situation differed. Consequently, Jan reminded Emma about the potential for the situation to become a lot more complex should the client feel discriminated against. And thus, with both subjective and objective views of the situation, Emma now felt prepared to take on the next steps in the ethical decision-making model.
As my colleagues have discussed, this model is created to outline the process required for ethical decision making. Whilst there are many governing bodies for psychologists, both international and domestic, the general consensus always relates back to the well-being and protection of the psychologist and client being of the utmost importance. In our case here, however, the duty of care also extends to the clients and colleagues who witness Jacques and Emma's interactions. Emma realized, following the conversation with her old supervisor, that her duty is to consider the rights and vulnerabilities of herself and Jacques, and her responsibility as a registered psychologist is to minimize these factors in her practice. Depending on the outcomes of this partnership, the ability to acknowledge potential future issues within consultations and ethical boundaries is something that Emma is required to continuously reevaluate. Could the implications of this issue affect Emma's long-term practice? Could current or future clients be affected by the dissolution of this client-psychologist relationship, or is it just her interactions with Jacques? As those outside of your session become aware of your potentially questionable interactions, the scope of effect is widened. Whilst Emma was initially taken aback by Jacques' interactions, adding another client into this immediately increases the effect size and thus adds other parties that may feel the need to discuss their interpretations of these actions with either their psychologist or, unfortunately, any legal or ethical managing body. The consideration of vulnerability is also a major factor in step 5 of the model, particularly for Emma, due to the cultural challenges previously mentioned by my colleague Elisa. The importance of perspective, a lack of bias upon self-reflection of the situation, was something that Emma was clearly aware of, and thus particular focus is placed on whether the cultural differences impacted Jacques' vulnerability and his naivety. In addition, would Emma's desire to not offend or insult Jacques further implicate her in an ethical crossing or violation? All good points to think about if you're ever in a situation like this with a client from a foreign country. It is also imperative for Emma to reevaluate her informed consent and how she handles her duty of care in early sessions to ensure that the client is fully aware of the expectations of conduct throughout their sessions. Whilst the current APS Code of Ethics outlines informed consent as typically covering a broad spectrum of expectations, particular focus for Emma could be on physical interactions with new clients, and even an updated consent agreement with current clients. In following with the 8-step model, the importance of preparation for action in step 6 creates the framework for decision making and a resolution to the issues plaguing the professional partnership. When consultations with colleagues, ethical and legal guidelines, and in-session behaviors and observations all negatively relate to each other, we are required as psychologists to generate alternative decisions based on these observations. Emma was clearly aware from their consultations and out-of-session interactions that something had to change. However, not wanting to rush into a drastic decision, the best option, and in following with the Kuchar and Key-Spiegel 8-step model, was to brainstorm positive and negative resolutions and the consequences associated with these actions. With the cultural differences, it was firstly imperative that Emma ensure her message that this physical contact was not acceptable was being fully comprehended by Jacques. Without a mutual understanding, any move towards possible termination could be misunderstood. thus creating more problems resulting in ethical and possibly legal ramifications. It is also important at this stage to format a time frame for decision making. Would these decisions be reevaluated at a set session? 1, 3, 5 maybe? Or would it be a free-flowing transition? The most difficult decision initially is between action and inaction. In step 5, it is clear that the decision predominantly lies with the psychologist, and how decisions are therefore her responsibility. But we have an inability to act unilaterally in these sessions, and thus a resolution is a team effort. Emma concluded that it would not be productive to act non-confrontationally and move on without a resolution, so a decision that may affect their future interactions was required. Emma decided that the most effective option, with the least potential ramifications, began with the idea of continued care, but with marginal differences. Should Jacques be happy to comply, would the use of a mediator be appropriate? A third party to observe and correct where they deem necessary. Someone like this may even have ideas of how to gently remind Jacques of the cultural norms and appropriate interactions in Australia without offending him. Alternately, would a same-sex colleague be better in this case? Not having experience with Jacques' interactions with men, would the same physical interactions occur? Would this just pass on the issues to another psychologist to deal with? Or would the least risky pathway be a continued one-on-one care until Jacques is in a more stable position in regards to his interpreted rejection, so that a transition to staggered sessions would be easier and possibly render continued sessions unnecessary?
After generating her list of alternative decisions, Emma moves on to step 7, where she will consider the consequences of each one. Basically, Emma sees herself as having two options. She can either terminate treatment with Jacques, referring him to another psychologist, or she can continue their therapy with amendments in place to prevent future instances of inappropriate touch. Whilst Emma finds the current situation with Jacques awkward and uncomfortable, the idea of terminating his treatment on the basis of his inappropriate behaviour seems unethical and unnecessary. In light of Jacques' history of abandonment, Emma considers the psychological cost of termination to be a high risk for him, particularly as his offending is not malicious. In addition, whilst terminating treatment may achieve the short-term goal of desisting unwelcome touch, the ongoing long-term effect of terminating Jacques' treatment may cause uncalculated trauma for him. Other potential risks in terminating treatment with Jacques are the possible violation of his individual rights, particularly as Emma has not yet given him the chance to change his culturally entrenched practice of greeting with a kiss. In contrast, Emma considers the option of continuing treatment with Jacques to involve a discussion around the topic of appropriate touch within a professional relationship. Whilst Emma believes this option will require time and effort to implement, both in and out of the therapy room, Emma feels ethically bound to give Jacques the chance to change his behaviour. As a psychologist, Emma sees the benefits of sensitively discussing Jacques' inappropriate social etiquette as a potential situation for personal growth and increased cultural awareness, both of which Emma believes will assist her client towards attaining his therapeutic goals. Emma is sure to document the entire decision-making process. Following on from step 7, where Emma considered her options, she now moves on to step 8, where she is required to make a decision. Emma believes that she has completed all phases of the 8-step process conscientiously and observes that her final decision will be backed by the best reasons. Emma feels that by speaking with both her colleague Carl, who witnessed the inappropriate incident between herself and Jacques, and her old supervisor Jan, Emma now has the confidence to move forward with a decision that feels like the obvious and right thing to do. Emma decides to set aside time at the beginning of her next scheduled session with Jacques to speak with him about what she feels was inappropriate touch. Emma believes that by discussing her sense of awkwardness when Jacques kisses her, she will both help him to understand why the greeting is inappropriate in a professional setting and help him to better integrate his cultural mannerisms. Emma believes she can handle the confrontation with Jacques in a sensitive and honest way, whilst appreciating Jacques' history with abandonment and his resulting trauma. By being honest with herself and her client, Emma thinks she can appease her ethical dilemma and create a more trusting relationship with Jacques as they progress with their treatment. Despite Emma feeling prepared and justified in her decision, she allows for the possibility that Jacques may suffer an element of harm or offence resulting from their discussion. Emma therefore decides that to minimise any sense of injury, following her conversation with Jacques, she will make a detailed note of what was said. Emma further decides that she will revisit her decision after 3 sessions with Jacques, and if she feels he has not taken on board her advice and amended his behaviour, she will be forced to consider the possibility of terminating treatment. That brings us to the end of today's panel discussion. Thank you all for listening. We hope you found our interpretation of the ethics of touch informative. Our case study focused on the theory, research, practice model, which our panel believes to be a relevant and interesting component of psychological study.